It was the sort of December evening Oxford does better than anywhere else in the world. The mist clinging to the cloisters, the sound of distant bells scattered through the damp air like fragments of forgotten prayer. I had not meant to attend the service at Magdalen that night. Habit, I suppose, or nostalgia, or the faint hope that beauty might drown out the dull ache of another year closing in upon itself. Inside, the chapel breathed that peculiar mixture of sanctity and fatigue. Candles trembled in their sconces. The choir boys' voices wove between the columns like threads of smoke. Somewhere behind me, a woman's cough, discreet and deliberate, fell in rhythm with the hymn. I remember thinking that even silence in Oxford has form and discipline. They began with the familiar, "Once in Royal David's City," sung with that self-conscious purity only the very young can manage. But the second carol was different. I had never heard it before. A strange, minor key thing that seemed older than the stones around us. The organ hesitated before the opening chord, as though uncertain of what followed. The choir master glanced down once at his score, and then lifted his hand. The melody rose, thin and sorrowful, and I caught the Latin refrain. Miserere nobis, quia peccavimus. The words folded back into the vaulting darkness, echoing like regret. When the service ended, the congregation shuffled out through the small side door that leads on to the cloister walk. I lingered, as I often do, pretending to search my pockets for a handkerchief. In truth, I wanted to hear the final notes decay into nothing. There was something unresolved in that melody, some chord that refused to rest. Outside, Lewis was waiting, stamping his feet against the cold. He asked if I'd heard the odd extra verse at the end. I said I had. He said it wasn't printed in the program. A local historian, he added, was supposed to have donated a forgotten carol for restoration, a Dr. Leonard Fenn, recently back from Vienna. He smiled in that way of his, as if to ask whether the world had gone slightly mad or if it was simply Oxford in Advent. I shrugged. Perhaps both. That night I walked home by way of Addison's Walk. The moon had hidden itself, and the path was slick with frost. I could still hear the choir in my head, that dissonant thread looping through the refrain. A carol for the dead, not the living, I thought. A strange notion, and yet it clung to me. When I reached my flat on North Parade, I poured a measure of whiskey and opened the window despite the cold. The bells of Magdalen were still ringing somewhere behind the fog. The sound reached me in long, uneven waves, as if half the city were breathing in time with their rhythm. I tried to hum the carol again, but failed. The melody slipped away each time I approached it, leaving only that fragment of Latin behind. Have mercy on us, for we have sinned. The next morning, Lewis called. He said a note had been found at the porter's lodge after the service. Unsigned, written in an elegant, slanted hand. It read, "A carol for the dead should never be sung for the living." I asked if he still had it. He said he did. I told him to bring it to the station. By the time he arrived, the rain had begun. Not the drenching kind, but that thin, persistent drizzle that makes the whole city smell of wet stone and cold iron. Lewis unfolded the note carefully, like a man presenting evidence in a dream. I studied the handwriting. It was confident, almost beautiful, the kind that comes from someone educated long ago, when pens still demanded patience. There was a faint indentation near the margin, as if a name had once been written there and later erased. I ran my thumb across it. The impression suggested a capital E, or perhaps I wanted it too. Lewis said the porter thought the letter had been slipped under the door around midnight. I asked whether Fenn had attended the service. He said yes. Second row, left side, alone. But the man had not returned to his lodgings afterwards. The bicycle was found later that night, leaning against the rail by Folly Bridge, its lamp still burning. Oxford is full of absences. The city feeds on them. Lost manuscripts, vanished scholars, rooms that once mattered to someone now long forgotten. But this felt different. There was something deliberate in the stillness around his disappearance, as if the night itself had taken notes. After Lewis left, I sat staring at the single line of the anonymous letter. I copied it into my notebook, the way one copies a line of verse whose meaning resists translation. A carol for the dead should never be sung for the living. The phrase had symmetry, like a clue, the kind of symmetry you find in music, or guilt. I underlined the words for the living twice. Then I closed the book, finished what remained of the whiskey, and listened to the rain tapping the window. It struck me that the melody from the night before had found a rhythm in that sound, a confession trying to be heard. Even now, years later, when the weather turns and the bells of Magdalen begin their winter chorus, I sometimes think I hear that refrain again, soft, hesitant, full of unfinished remorse, and I remember that evening as the beginning of something I could never quite explain, only follow, the night when a carol became a crime. I've often thought that Oxford conceals its dead more elegantly than it honors its living. The river is part of that conspiracy. Patient, indifferent, always ready to take in what the rest of us prefer, not to notice. That morning, it was the river that held the first whisper of Leonard Fenn. Lewis brought me the report as I was stirring sugar into a second cup of coffee that needed neither stirring nor sugar. A bicycle had been found at Folly Bridge. The lamp was still on, glowing faintly against the mist. No rider, no footprints, no cry in the night, just the quiet certainty of absence. He said the man's name with the careful respect of someone who doesn't yet know whether the missing are to be mourned or merely found. Dr. Leonard Fenn, a music historian attached to St. Silas College, though technically unemployed since the department's funding collapse. I recalled seeing the name in the program from the carol service. He was the donor of the forgotten composition, the one whose melody had stayed in my head like a trapped echo. Lewis asked if I believed in coincidence. I told him I didn't, but I often believed in the appearance of it. He said the man's papers suggested he'd been researching a 17th-century composer named Silas Merton, who died in debtor's prison and supposedly wrote his last carol with his own blood. A dramatic story, and Oxford loves its fictions draped in Latin. We walked to the college together, our steps loud against the flagstones. Inside the quadrangle, the porter pointed toward Fenn's rooms, top floor, south corner, view of the bell tower. The curtains were half drawn, the window slightly open as though he'd meant to return. The air inside was the usual mixture of stale tobacco and neglected books. A gramophone sat by the bed, a record still resting on the turntable. When I lowered the needle, a few notes trembled out. The same strange carol, warped by scratches, unfinished. There were papers everywhere, drafts, musical notations, half-translated Latin, and a single letter folded twice. I read it once, then again, though the second reading was less for comprehension than tone. You seek harmony where none exists. Some songs should not be revived, no signature. But the handwriting was elegant, looping, and unmistakably female. Lewis busied himself checking the small details, the sherry bottle, the unlocked drawer, the unwashed glass. He noticed that the man's bicycle key was missing. I noticed something else, the program from the carol service, open on the desk and annotated in pencil. Next to the title, The Canticle of St. Silas, Fenn had written one phrase, "Bells remember." I asked the porter whether Fenn had any close visitors. The man hesitated. There had been a woman, he said finally. Arrived 2 days before the service, asked for Fenn by name. Stayed an hour, left in tears. Northern accent. He hadn't caught her name, but she'd left a small parcel. He assumed it was a gift. Outside, the rain had become steadier, softening the outlines of the city. I stood beneath the archway and watched water gather in the cracks of the pavement. Lewis remarked that it could be suicide. A lonely man, too many disappointments, a river close at hand. Possible, I said. Probable, even. But I couldn't reconcile the notion of self-destruction with that burning bicycle lamp. A man intent on vanishing doesn't leave a witness of light behind. Later, back at the station, I opened the folded letter again. The ink had bled slightly where a drop of moisture, perhaps a tear, perhaps something more careless, had touched it. The scent of old perfume lingered faintly on the paper. I copied the handwriting onto my pad, out of habit more than need, and wrote below it. Northern accent. Eleanor? Then I crossed the name out. Too early for names. Too dangerous to hope for them. That night I sat by my window with a crossword, though I solved nothing. One clue stayed with me. Voice that cannot be silenced. 7. I didn't fill it in. The answer felt too close to what we were living. Oxford slept uneasily beneath the fog. Somewhere, the bells of Magdalen tolled the hour, and in the pause that followed I thought I heard a single note held too long, a dissonance the city would never admit to hearing. The next morning, the river gave up a scrap of music paper lodged against the reeds. Only a few bars, written in a hurried hand, smudged and torn, but the final line remained legible. Miserere nobis, quia peccavimus. Have mercy on us, for we have sinned. The man who never came home had left his confession on the water. There are few places in Oxford quieter than the Bodleian in winter. The air itself seems to settle into dust. One learns to hear in layers. The turning of pages, the hesitant cough, the secretive sigh of the leather bindings as if the books themselves were listening. I've always liked that kind of silence. It lets a man's thoughts arrive without warning. Lewis and I entered just after noon, our coats leaving small puddles on the flagstones. Fenn's reading slip waited for us at the desk. Neat, almost ceremonial. The Canticle of St. Silas, copied in the early 1700s, provenance uncertain. The librarian, a pale woman with hair the color of stale parchment, recognized his name. He had been a regular visitor, she said, though visitor was too warm a word. He read as if being pursued by something only visible between the lines. She mentioned the argument. A young scholar, Miss Courtenay, had accused him of plagiarism, a tedious academic squabble, or so she believed. Yet her tone faltered slightly when I asked what had provoked it. Fenn had claimed discovery of a lost verse, but Miss Courtenay insisted it had been hers all along. The librarian looked to the shelves when she spoke, as if uncertain whether the books might disapprove. The manuscript lay before us in its glass cradle. I studied it the way some men study faces. The notation was archaic, written in brown ink that had faded like old blood. The Latin text beneath the stubs read like a prayer unfinished. Miserere nobis, the refrain again. Beneath one margin, in a different hand, someone had written Silas sonat memoria campanarum. Silas sounds in the memory of bells. Lewis said it sounded like nonsense. I told him nonsense in Oxford often proves to be confession disguised as scholarship. He said I was being poetic again. I told him poetry is the only language this city truly understands. The librarian returned with the signing, Ledger. Fenn had last consulted the manuscript 2 days before the carol service. A second name appeared beneath his, Miss Courtenay's. I noticed she had dated it incorrectly, writing the 14th where the 13th should have been. A small thing, yet deliberate errors often tell larger truths. Perhaps she wished to obscure coincidence. Perhaps she wanted to be seen and unseen in equal measure. As we left, rain began to prick at the glass roof. The sound was curiously rhythmic, like fingers tapping a forgotten melody. I found myself humming the carol again, only to realize that what lingered in my mind was not the music, but the silence between the notes. A silence shaped by guilt. We walked toward Radcliffe Square. Lewis kept talking about Fenn's supposed research, the obscure composer Silas Merton, the prison death, the legends of madness and lost hymns. I let him talk. What held my attention was a different pattern entirely. A scholar vanishes after resurrecting a carol meant for the dead, a young woman argues authorship, a note appears warning against its song. In Oxford, coincidence is rarely accidental. We stopped at the small cafe beside the Clarendon building. Lewis ordered tea. I took whiskey disguised as coffee. The warmth helped nothing. I asked whether Miss Courtenay had been interviewed. He said she had agreed to meet us the next day. Bright girl, apparently, with a reputation for being too clever by half. He smiled, expecting irony. I didn't return it. I was thinking of Fenn's phrase in the margin, the memory of bells. That evening, I returned alone. The librarian, closing up, allowed me one last glance at the manuscript. I leaned closer, tracing the notation with my eyes. A faint indentation ran beneath the stave, invisible at first. Not ink. Pressure. Someone had written another line and then erased it. Under angled light, the ghost of the words appeared. He knows. Who did? The composer, the scholar, the singer. The phrase felt less like a message and more like a warning overheard through time. Outside, the bells of Magdalen struck the hour, their sound muffled by mist. Each note carried a kind of gravity, as if it knew it was echoing across centuries. Lewis had once said that I listen for meaning where there is none. Perhaps he was right, yet I have learned that meaning seldom announces itself. It hides in the margin, in the wrong date, in a phrase too carefully chosen. As I walked back across the quad, the rain stopped. The flagstones gleamed faintly under the lanterns. From somewhere deep within the library, a final creak echoed. Wood shifting, or perhaps a door closing on its own. I turned, half expecting a figure at the window, but there was only the reflection of my own face, blurred by mist. I remember thinking that archives keep more than books. They keep the weight of secrets no one dares read aloud. And that night, Oxford felt very much alive with its dead. Memory, like music, is never faithful. It repeats the notes but alters the tempo, softens the chords, forgets where to pause. I've come to distrust those who claim to remember too clearly. They are usually rehearsing. Emma Courtenay lived in a narrow Georgian terrace off Iffley Road, one of those places that smells of ambition and damp in equal measure. She opened the door herself, her hand ink-stained, her hair tied back in a manner both practical and offensive. She looked younger than her reputation and spoke older than her years. Lewis had told her why we came, but she offered no tea, only space, the sort that implies she'd rather we left before we entered. She said Fenn had been a thief, a parasite who stole her research and dressed it in academic Latin. I asked what he'd stolen. Her tone shifted, not the discovery itself, but the meaning. He had taken the same facts, arranged them differently, and made them sing. I asked whether she had seen him after the carol service. She looked toward the window, where rain threaded the glass like an afterthought. No, she said. She had seen enough of him long before that. It is curious how people speak of distance, as if one can ever measure it. I noticed her fingers restlessly tracing the edge of a photograph on her desk. A college choir, the faces half familiar, the composition too careful. Fenn stood at the edge, unsmiling, and beside him a woman with sharp eyes and a kind of sorrow that even photography couldn't flatten. Eleanor Rook, she said when I gestured. Once the best alto St. Silas ever had. Fenn wrote to her last term, trying to coax her out of whatever grave she'd buried herself in. Said she was the key to understanding the carol. The phrase struck me as strange. Not a witness. A key. Lewis shifted in his chair, uneasy among the detritus of scholarship. Piles of manuscripts, half-drunk cups of coffee, a cracked metronome that ticked faintly though it hadn't been wound. Emma noticed my glance. "He left me that," she said, "years ago. Said time needed a rhythm to stay honest." She smiled then, brittle as old paper. When we left, Lewis muttered that she was hiding something. I said everyone was. But it wasn't guilt I'd seen in her face. It was envy, the intellectual kind that corrodes without ever confessing itself. Our next visit was to Mrs. Danby, Fenn's landlady, the sort of woman whose kindness is a reflex rather than a virtue. Her house smelled of furniture, polish, and boiled cabbage. She spoke with the rehearsed sorrow of someone who had already told the story to neighbors, journalists, and herself. "A quiet man," she said. "Polite. Too polite, if you ask me. Always thanking me for things I hadn't done." She remembered the visitor, a woman finely dressed, perhaps too finely for the street. Left an envelope on his desk, said it was personal. He'd been pacing after that, humming to himself, the same tune over and over. A carol, she thought. She showed us his room. The curtains were still, drawn though the day had turned bright. On the mantelpiece sat a single wine glass, unwashed, with a ring of dust beneath it. I noticed the faintest trace of lipstick. Not red, more the pale rose shade women wear when they no longer expect to be looked at closely. I said nothing. Lewis, with his methodical decency, checked the drawers. "Nothing useful," he said. "But usefulness is a vulgar measure." I examined the shelf above the bed. Books mostly on music theory, but one stood out. The Oxford Anthology of Sacred Verse. Inside the flyleaf was a dedication, to L, from E.R. May the bells forgive what the heart cannot. I copied it into my notebook. When we left, Mrs. Danby followed us to the gate. She said she had found something else after the police had gone, a slip of paper under the carpet near the bed, a fragment of sheet music. I took it carefully, the edges torn, notes written in pencil, faint as if erased by hesitation. Beneath the staves was a line of Latin, the same phrase again, Miserere nobis, quia peccavimus. Lewis frowned. She said it means mercy, right? I nodded, but mercy rarely arrives without reason. That evening, I sat alone in my flat, the paper spread beside my glass. The tune lingered in my head. Not quite right, almost beautiful, like something remembered through regret. I tried to imagine Fenn at his desk, the lamp burning low, the carol whispering from some distant century, and a woman's voice singing a verse meant never to be heard again. It struck me then, faint but certain, that whoever sent that envelope knew precisely what the carol contained, and that its melody was not about redemption at all, but remembrance. The women who remembered, I thought, were the ones who could never quite forget. I have never much cared for music manuscripts. They lie to the eye, lines and dots pretending to be emotion, mathematics disguised as grace. Yet there I was that afternoon, sitting at Fenn's desk, staring at a sheet of paper that seemed to hum faintly even in silence. Lewis had placed it before me like something dangerous. A sealed envelope found in Fenn's drawer, its edges singed slightly as if held too near a flame. Inside, a single page of music and a line of Latin written in a feminine hand. Miserere nobis, quia peccavimus. The same phrase that had followed me through the case like a refrain. He said the landlady had sworn it wasn't there before. Perhaps she was right, or perhaps it had been waiting for someone who would understand that some notes are not meant to be sung aloud. I studied the handwriting first. Elegant, slanted, educated. A musician's hand, not an academic's. There was a restraint to it, beauty softened by shame. The ink slightly paler in one section, as though the writer's hand had trembled before finishing the line. The signature was missing, but the envelope had been sealed with a faint trace of wax in the shape of a small bird, its wings broken. I had seen that seal before, in the archives. Eleanor Rook. Lewis watched me from the other side of the desk. He said something about evidence, about forwarding it to forensics. I told him to wait. He didn't argue. He has learned the value of silence, which is rarer than obedience. The manuscript itself was short, 16 bars, unfinished. The melody was haunting even without hearing it, the intervals unnaturally tight, collapsing inward like something trying to hide. The final line trailed off mid-phrase. No resolving chord, no closure. A confession without absolution. I found myself humming it quietly, almost unwillingly. The tune belonged to that same carol sung at Magdalen, only darker, older, stripped of comfort. Beneath the staves, faint pencil marks hinted at revisions, erased words that refused complete erasure. Under the right light, I could make out 2 fragments, December and bells. Lewis noticed the page shaking slightly in my hand. I told him it was the draft from the so-called Lost Carol, but older, more intimate, perhaps the original version. He asked who had sent it. I said nothing. Later, in the quiet of my office, I read the Latin again. Have mercy on us, for we have sinned. The plural bothered me. Not me, but us. Whoever wrote it was not alone in their guilt. The telephone rang once that evening. A sound that always feels like a question you cannot ignore. It was the choir master from Magdalen. He'd found something in the hymn book collection, a note, unsigned, requesting that the mysterious carol be performed at the service in memory of one who could not return. The handwriting, he said, seemed familiar, but he couldn't place it. I told him not to trouble himself further, though I already knew. Memory can be cruel when it dresses itself as logic. I went back to my notes, to the marginalia in Fenn's copy of the Canticle of St. Silas. One phrase had returned again and again, beneath the bells. At first I'd thought it a metaphor, the kind of lyrical indulgence scholars enjoy. But something about the wax seal, the fragments, the erased word December began to shape itself into a pattern. Fenn had been searching not just for a lost melody, but for an event, a place buried under the weight of time. Beneath the bells was not poetry, it was geography. The Belfry, perhaps, or the crypt beneath St. Silas College Chapel. I took a sip of whiskey, the sort of drink that refuses to comfort, and stared at the music again. The melody formed itself in my head now with terrible clarity. The final note, that unresolved, aching interval, seemed to point downward, like descent, the sound of falling, not rising. Lewis would later insist that I imagined the rest. The echo, the faint vibration underfoot, the impression that something beneath the college was stirring again. But I remember it clearly. The bells had begun to ring, though not from any tower I could see. Their sound seemed to come from the paper itself, vibrating softly, as if remembering its origin. I closed the file, placed the envelope inside, and locked the drawer. For once, the act felt less like evidence being preserved and more like prayer being postponed. That night, as I walked home past the darkened choir school, I caught a faint sound from within, a single voice humming the carol's refrain. Not perfectly. A note slightly sharp, like a question unresolved. I stopped to listen, though I knew no one was there. Some songs, once written, never end. They merely wait for someone foolish enough to hear them again. The bells of St. Silas have a peculiar timbre, too pure for their age, too sorrowful for their purpose. They sound less like instruments of faith and more like a warning left behind by men who no longer believed. I remember standing beneath them that evening, the rain turning the courtyard slick and colorless, and thinking that Oxford has always been at its most truthful in the wet. Lewis had found the chapel open. No service, no light except for the narrow flame of a votive candle forgotten by the sacristan. The air was sharp with the smell of wax and stone. Somewhere above, the faint click of metal against metal, the chain of the bell hammer, still trembling after use. He said there was no reason to be there, not yet, not without a warrant. I said we were here for the sound, not the sight. He gave me that patient look that means he will wait out my reasoning. I asked him if he'd ever noticed how some bells in Oxford echo longer than others. He said he hadn't thought about it. I told him it depended not on the metal but the ground beneath. Some towers rest on clay, others on hollow crypts. The ring tells you what's buried underneath. He said I was becoming morbid. I told him perhaps I always had been. The rain thickened. Inside the vestry, we found what I had been looking for. The ledger of maintenance for the tower. Pages yellowed, dates stretching back decades. There, half a century earlier, a brief entry in the hand of the then Provost Rook. Bell casing repaired, foundation inspected, lower chamber sealed. No reason given, no subsequent inspection recorded. Lewis said it could mean anything. I said it could mean guilt. On the desk lay a small brass key, tarnished and without tag. I lifted it to the candlelight and saw it bore the engraving of a treble clef. Music again. Always music. I pocketed it. From the chancel, the bells stirred faintly, not by human hand, but by the wind finding its way through the ropes. The sound was thin, accidental, yet it filled the chapel like breath returning to a body. I walked to the center aisle, looked up, and for a moment felt the weight of the tower pressing downward, centuries of sound turned to silence. Somewhere below our feet, beneath those same stones that had heard confessions, vows, and lies, something remained sealed, and someone had wanted it that way. We spoke little as we left. Oxford was half drowned, the lamps along the high street flickering through mist. I thought of Eleanor Rook, the forgotten chorister, her father's disgrace, and that same refrain in Fenn's notes, beneath the bells. The phrase had ceased to be metaphor. It was location disguised as liturgy. Later that night in my flat, I poured a whiskey and unfolded the Carol manuscript again. I had listened to the recording of the Magdalene service earlier that evening. That dissonant verse slipped in by an anonymous hand. One bar repeated twice, where the composer's version demanded only once. A small duplication, but deliberate. Repetition where there should be silence. I wrote it down as if solving a crossword. Echo, that was the clue. The second ringing, the double note, the reflection of sound. The carol wasn't a song at all. It was a map disguised in melody. Its rhythm mirrored the bell sequence of St. Silas. Fenn had rediscovered it, perhaps even understood it, and paid the price. The city outside was hushed, except for the distant rumor of traffic along St. Aldate's. I thought about the people drawn to sacred spaces, scholars, singers, sinners, all trying to translate something they could never quite hear clearly. Lewis called shortly after midnight. The forensics team had confirmed that the sedative found in Fenn's system was administered hours before he drowned. I thanked him and hung up. It meant what I feared. He hadn't gone to the river by choice. I left my glass unfinished, took the brass key from my pocket, and turned it over in my hand. The metal left a faint green mark on my palm, like an old scar reopening. I wondered whether the sealed chamber beneath the bells had been open since 1964, or whether it was waiting for me alone. When I finally lay down, I could still hear them, faintly, rhythmically, patient. Bells tolling for no one in particular. Bells that had learned how to remember. And somewhere within that lingering sound, I heard another note. Softer but persistent. The voice of a woman long forgotten, singing her way back into the city's conscience. I have never liked heights, There is something indecent about being above the city, looking down at roofs and people as if one were God with a bad conscience. Yet that morning found me climbing the narrow spiral of the St. Silas belfry, each step echoing like a metronome of regret. The smell of dust and iron grew heavier as I climbed. Lewis followed a few steps behind, grumbling softly about drafts and vertigo. I told him he needn't come. He said someone had to make sure I didn't fall, though I suspect he feared what I might find more than any fall. The tower was older than the rest of the college. The stone changed color halfway up, as if time itself had been mortared into its walls. Pigeons fled when we reached the landing, their wings cutting the stale air with sound too violent for that stillness. The bells hung above like vast, sleeping animals. I had brought the brass key, the one engraved with the treble clef. It fit the lock on the small wooden door near the mechanism, a door I might have ignored had I not noticed the faint impression of a wax seal long since torn away. Inside was a narrow crawl space, black with neglect. The beam of my torch found dust thick as velvet, a rotted ladder leading downward, and beneath it something wrapped in cloth. Lewis asked whether we should call for gloves. I said no. Some things ask to be touched, even when one knows better. The bundle came apart reluctantly, revealing an old diary bound in cracked leather. The initials E.R. were faintly embossed in gold. Eleanor Rook. The pages clung together, water-stained and warped by time. The ink had bled into the fibers so that the writing seemed almost to whisper rather than speak. The first entry I could read was dated December 1964. Father says the truth must stay buried. He says the bells will cover it. I turned another page. The bursar threatened him. I heard them in the vestry. Money missing from the endowment, and Father's signature where it should not be. He said he would put it right, but I know he meant something else. Lewis leaned in beside me, his breath clouding in the cold. He asked if I believed it. I said belief was for choirs. What mattered was the rhythm of deceit, how people arrange their guilt into harmony. Further entries grew fragmented, the handwriting less controlled. He made me copy the ledgers. I told him I couldn't, but he said the college must survive. They all must sing their part, he said. And later, Fen knows. He found the carol in Father's papers. He says it's an echo of confession. He says he'll publish it. He must not. I stopped reading. The air felt smaller. The diary trembled slightly in my hands. Or perhaps I did. Lewis pointed at a faint note scrawled across the inside cover, half hidden beneath a smear of dust. If truth rings, silence it beneath the bells. The sound of rain began to drum faintly against the tower slats. Somewhere below, the college stirred with its usual complacency. I thought of Eleanor, a young woman trapped between duty and disgrace, listening to her father's lies wrapped in the comfort of Latin hymns, and Fen, foolish, persistent Fen, reopening a wound the college had long forgotten it possessed. Lewis asked what I thought it meant. I told him the truth always sounds different depending on where one stands. He looked unconvinced, which, to his credit, meant he was beginning to think like me. We carried the diary down in silence. Halfway to the bottom, I stopped. On the wall, barely visible in the gloom, someone had carved a few letters. E.R. followed by the faint outline of a bell. The etching was fresh compared to the stone around it. Someone had returned here after her, perhaps Fen, perhaps another. Outside, the sky had bruised into twilight, though it was barely noon. I gave the diary to Lewis for evidence, but kept the small fragment of ribbon that had served as its marker. It smelled faintly of incense and dust. Later, back in my flat, I laid it beside the manuscript. Both shared the same phrasing of sorrow, the same pauses between notes, the same ache of something half-confessed. I began to see it as one continuous composition written across time, guilt transposed into melody, truth annotated in the margins. I wrote in my notebook a single phrase. Confession requires audience. Fenn had played that role, willingly or not. Eleanor had written hers and sealed it behind bells, and now, years later, I had become the unwilling listener. That night, as I tried to sleep, the sound of the Belfry returned. Not the bells themselves, but the silence that follows them, that deep, resonant nothing which lingers longer than sound ever could. I thought of the diary resting in an evidence bag somewhere, and of a woman whose sin had been loyalty. Oxford was quiet then, as if the whole city held its breath. I lay awake, listening for the next toll. There are moments in every investigation when the facts begin to hum, not in clarity, but dissonance. That afternoon, Oxford seemed to breathe in that same uneasy rhythm. The city was washed clean by rain, yet the pavement still gleamed like old regrets. I remember standing beneath the iron gates of the college, listening to the faint toll of Magdalen's bells and wondering whether truth, like music, could ever be performed without distortion. Emma Courtenay had agreed to meet again. The library's upper reading room, empty except for her and the dust, smelled of old vellum and something faintly medicinal, as though scholarship itself required antiseptic. She looked composed, though the kind of composure that comes from rehearsal rather than calm. I told her about the diary, about Eleanor Rook, about the entry that mentioned Fenn. Her face didn't move, but her hands betrayed her, the right one tightening slightly on the armrest, the left lifting her pen as if to make a note that never came. She said she had never met Eleanor. I believed her, but only in the limited way one believes a witness protecting her own version of events. She spoke of Fenn again, how he had promised to credit her for the Carroll's reconstruction, how he had then excluded her name entirely. She said she had written to the college to complain. I asked whether she'd written the anonymous letter that appeared at the porter's lodge. She didn't answer directly, only said that people write all sorts of things when they feel unheard. It was there, in the way she used the word unheard, that something stirred in me. The carol itself had been written in minor key, yet at the service it had been sung in major. A subtle change, imperceptible to the untrained ear, but deliberate. Someone had altered its emotional truth. Lewis joined me later at the King's Arms. He brought with him the coroner's preliminary report. Fenn had ingested a mild sedative before his death. Not enough to kill, only to still the nerves. A slip of comfort that had turned to silence. I said nothing, only traced my finger around the rim of my glass, until the sound wavered into an almost pitch. He asked what I thought of Emma. Clever, I said, wounded. The kind of woman who'd rather be wrong in Latin than right in English. He frowned, said that wasn't evidence. I told him neither was life. When I returned to my rooms that evening, the post had arrived. Among the circulars and invoices was a small envelope, unstamped, slipped through by hand. Inside, a torn scrap from a choral program, the Canticle of St. Silas, underlined twice, and beneath it, written in an unmistakably feminine hand, he played it wrong. No signature. No explanation. I placed the note beside the copy of the Carroll manuscript. The final bar in Fenn's version had a curious alteration, a single half note where the original used a rest. In music, silence carries meaning. It is where the emotion breathes. Fenn, perhaps, had filled a silence meant to accuse, or someone else had done so after him. I found myself at the piano, unpracticed fingers tracing the melody by instinct. The tune emerged fragile and familiar. Yet when I reached the last phrase, the one he had altered, I hesitated. The harmony refused to settle. There was an echo, not of resolution, but of return. I tried it the other way, restoring the rest where the note should have been. The sound that followed was emptier, but somehow truer. Lewis would later say I'd been chasing ghosts through notation. Perhaps I had. But the ghosts in Oxford tend to keep better records than the living. The next morning I visited the chapel again. The choir was rehearsing something cheerful. Haydn, I think. But the air still held traces of Fenn's lament. I watched them through the half-open door, their voices layered, pure, and painfully human. A wrong note appeared midway, soft but persistent. The choir master paused, corrected them, and smiled. They tried again, perfect this time. And yet, as the final chord faded, I found myself missing the imperfection. Later that night, I wrote in my notebook, "Harmony is only the disguise of difference." Fenn had tried to make peace with Emma, with Eleanor, with himself, by rewriting what was meant to remain unresolved. But Oxford does not forgive correction. It prefers its truths unfinished, its melodies unended. The bells began again near midnight. They rang not for service or ceremony, but for the hour. Even so, I could swear their intervals were slightly wrong. One note too sharp, one too long. Perhaps it was the wind. Perhaps the tower itself remembered. I sat by the window listening until the sound dissolved into rain. The city slept, but the false harmony lingered. A mistake too deliberate to be accidental, too human to be divine. There is a peculiar loneliness in hearing one's own intuition proven right. It never feels like triumph, more like the low toll of a bell marking a death one expected, but hoped might be delayed. That was how I felt when I listened again to the recording from the carol service. Lewis had fetched it from the college archivist, who handled it like a relic from a saint. The choir's voices floated through the static, bright and disciplined. But then came that unsettling passage, the verse that did not belong. I had heard it before, of course, but this time I was listening not to the melody, but to the mistake within it. Music, like truth, reveals itself most plainly in error. And there it was. A single bar sung a tone higher than the notation demanded. It should have been mercy, but what reached the ear was memory. A vowel's difference, a word's confession. Lewis didn't hear it at first. He was checking his notes, tracing the cold sequence of events that led from Fenn's manuscript to the riverbank. I stopped the tape and rewound it. "Listen again," I said. He frowned, humored me, and then caught it. That small shift, like a shadow passing between two faces that look the same until one smiles. He said it might be a copying error. I told him that in Oxford, even our mistakes are intentional. The next morning I visited the choir master. His office overlooked the cloisters, where students hurried through the drizzle with their collars up and ambitions folded under their arms. He was a precise man. Bow tie, polished shoes, a voice trained to carry both authority and regret. He said the extra verse had been delivered to him by Fenn himself, typed neatly, annotated in red. I asked if he had kept it. He had not. He thought it inauthentic, a scholar's vanity, but he admitted to having performed it nonetheless, out of curiosity. Curiosity, the one sin Oxford forgives least when it turns fatal. I asked whether anyone else had seen the page. A pause, the faint clink of a teacup. "A Miss Courtenay," he said. She had come to the rehearsal the night before, claiming Fenn had stolen her transcription. She'd been emotional, though not hysterical. I remembered her voice from our last meeting, too calm, as if mourning something she could not quite name. When I left, the rain had turned to sleet. I walked along Merton Street, my collar soaked, my mind sifting through the contradictions like a crossword with its grid smudged. Mercy or memory? Which had Fenn meant to write? Or had he understood, like Eleanor Rook before him, that the two were indistinguishable? The past always asks for mercy, and the present can only remember. At the station, Lewis was waiting with the results of the handwriting analysis. The anonymous note, a carol for the dead should never be sung for the living, matched the writing on the envelope found in Fenn's desk. Both belonged to a woman, the same hand, the same rhythm of pressure and pause, but the ink was different. One fountain, one ballpoint. The kind of distinction, notice only when you look too closely. We drove back to the college as the light drained out of the afternoon. The porter greeted us with the weary relief of someone who knows his establishment has become a stage for tragedy. I asked him to play the chapel's recording again, this time through the chapel loudspeakers. The sound filled the nave, echoing against the vaulted ceiling until the words blurred into one another. And in that echo, something revealed itself. The extra verse, the so-called lost refrain, had been spliced into the recording, not performed live, but inserted afterward. A studio edit, deliberate and expert. Fenn had not arranged the choir's final version. Someone else had. The signature was there, invisible yet unmistakable, a small temporal disjunction between the breath and the word. You could almost hear him trying to sing over himself. Lewis looked at me as the bells outside began to strike the quarter. "So what does it mean?" he asked. "It means," I said quietly, "that the man wanted to be heard long after he was gone. He buried his confession where it could never die, inside the sound of forgiveness." We stood there a while longer, the rain finding its rhythm on the chapel roof, the recording still whispering in its final cadence, and I thought again of that line from Eleanor's diary. He promised to destroy the proof, but the bells remember everything. Perhaps he had destroyed the paper, but not the song. That night I poured a measure of whiskey and wrote 3 words in my notebook. The wrong verse. It looked harmless enough on the page, but I knew it was not wrong at all. It was deliberate, and it was addressed to someone. I closed the book, switched off the lamp, and listened to the bells. They were out of tune, slightly sharp, but somehow more human for it. There are nights when Oxford feels older than the world itself, when even the air seems to hum with what it remembers. That evening was one of them. The bells had stopped hours ago, yet the echo of their tolling still lingered between the cloisters, as though refusing to die. Lewis walked beside me through the drizzle, his coat collar turned up, his silence patient. I think he knew that words would have been wasted. We'd both heard the same confession, though only one of us recognized it for what it was. Mrs. Danby met us in the chapel vestibule. She looked smaller than I remembered, folded into herself like a letter long unopened. Her hands trembled when she handed me the key to the Belfry. She said she wanted to help, that she'd prayed every night for forgiveness, though not always for her own soul. We climbed the narrow stairway together. The air grew colder as we ascended, smelling faintly of iron and mildew. Each step groaned beneath the weight of memory. When we reached the chamber, she hesitated at the threshold, whispering that the bells had been silent since that night, the night Fenn died. I told her they were never silent. Not really. She stayed near the door while I examined the space. The ropes hung like motionless pendulums, their fibers stiff with age. The floorboards were warped, but beneath one plank near the wall, the dust had been disturbed. I pried it open with my pocket knife. Inside was a bundle wrapped in cloth. Another manuscript, older, stained by time and damp. The handwriting was Eleanor Rook's. I read aloud, quietly, as if to no one. He found what father hid. I told him it would ruin us all. He said truth was mercy, but mercy kills slower than lies. Mrs. Danby began to weep softly. She confessed then, not in sentences, but in fragments, as though speaking were a form of excavation. Fenn had come to her days before his death, asking about Eleanor. He discovered her diary, found the carol, and realized what it concealed. He believed the hymn had been composed not as devotion, but as confession, a musical cipher documenting the embezzlement that had destroyed Eleanor's father. Each interval corresponded to a ledger number. Each verse encoded an admission. Fenn had wanted to publish it, to give the truth voice, but Mrs. Danby, loyal, terrified Mrs. Danby, had begged him not to. She had once loved Eleanor, she said, loved her enough to guard her shame. She had given Fenn the sedative only to calm him. He had been shaking, incoherent, promising he'd tell the college before nightfall. She wanted time to think, only time. But he never woke. The silence after her confession felt longer than any sentence I could have passed. Lewis led her away gently. I stayed behind, listening to the rain tapping against the leaded glass. On the lectern near the ropes lay a small tape recorder, the kind used for rehearsals. It was still working, a thin red light flickering like a pulse. I pressed play. The carol filled the chamber. The same one from that winter's service, but sung not by a choir, by a single voice, hers, Mrs. Danby's voice, younger, trembling yet devout, and beneath it, faintly, another voice, Fenn's, reading aloud the Latin refrain. Miserere nobis, quia peccavimus, have mercy on us, for we have sinned. When the recording ended, I rewound it and listened again. Somewhere in the second verse, just before her final breath, a whisper, almost imperceptible. Forgive her. Not me. Her. I switched it off and stood there in the dim light, the air thick with the scent of wax and dust. The bells above groaned softly in the wind, tuning themselves to a chord no human ear could quite name. I thought of Eleanor Rook, her father, Fenn, Mrs. Danby, a chain of mercy and guilt that had circled itself until it became harmony. On my way out, I paused beneath the tower and looked up. The rain had stopped, and a thin mist hung over the spire. Somewhere in that half-dark, I fancied I heard a single bell note strike. Not loud, not mournful, but resolved. Later, in my flat, I poured the last of the whiskey and wrote the closing line of my report. It read simply, "The carol beneath the belfry was sung in remembrance, not redemption." I didn't sign my name. Some stories are better left anonymous.